My goodness. Welcome, everyone. My heart's beating on seeing everyone here.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this really special, exciting event. This is the concluding event of the Eco Bhakti Weekend, which I know some of you have been able to attend all three events, and we're so grateful for that. For those who haven't been able to attend the earlier events, we are going to shortly put in the chat box some information about how to connect to those recordings, either on YouTube or through our Sacred Ecology Forum. So we'll do that shortly, but we're so excited about this concluding event where we will explore the intersections of poetry, of sacred sound, of nature, and of our connection to the divine and to one another. So quite a lot for our guest presenter to take us through, but we know that she's up to the task. I'm so delighted and pleased on so many levels. Our presenter this afternoon is one of my heroes in devotional life. I don't want to embarrass her, but she really is and has been for quite a while. And is also someone who has, over the years, become a dear friend and who has become family and is very much a spiritual sister. So we're just so honored and delighted to have with us Jonavi Harrison. Jonavi, as many of you know, was raised in a devotional bhakti setting. She was raised in a Vaishnava Hindu family at a temple known as Bhaktivedanta Manor in England. She is a writer, a musician, an artist, and someone who very much seeks to channel her creative expressions into self-realization and service and aims to inspire others to do likewise. Jonavi trained in both Western as well as Indian classical dance and music, along with writing and the visual arts. After graduating with a BA in linguistics and creative writing, she traveled internationally for a number of years, presenting the dynamic stories and spiritual culture of India for a fresh and contemporary audience. She has been a member of a number of sacred music collectives, including Sita and the Hanuman, and has also collaborated with a number of other artists, including Krishnadas, Shyamdas, Wa, Jayutal, and most recently, she is, as many of you know, she has been collaborating with the contemporary pop artist Willow Smith. In 2012, Jonavi was presented with a Youth Achievement Award at the UK House of Lords for her efforts to uplift society through sacred music. And in 2015, she released her debut sacred music album, Like a River to the Sea, and also took part in the Bhakti Without Borders album, for which she was nominated for a Grammy Music Award. Jonavi is also a regularly featured presenter for BBC Radio, where she speaks on topics such as spirituality, sacred sound, and apropos of today's workshop on sacred nature. She now helps to run Kirtan-based events based in New York City and in London. And through the power of Zoom and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and social media, she is able to share her message and her music with fans, followers, and admirers across the globe. So we're so honored and so excited to have her back with us. She was at Princeton University almost a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, helping us to celebrate Diwali. And of course, circumstances being what they are, we're not able to host her in person, but we're so excited to have her on this virtual platform and to have her as part of this very special collaboration. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jonavi, but maybe from our muted out presence wherever we are, maybe we can just, from the core of our hearts, give her a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vineet, Venkata. It's it's actually really exciting to be here with you. I mean, I thought that it would be, but now that I'm seeing all your beautiful faces, I'm feeling genuinely 10 times more excited, and also, if I can admit, a bit nervous, because it feels like a long time now, many, many months since I've been seeing a big gathering in person. Like, it's not exactly in person, but I see your faces. I feel that we are here together in the same room. Thank you to all of you who have your cameras on, because it really does feel like a very real connection. Um, and yes, it's been many months. All of us have been experiencing, well, a real variety of experiences during this time. But I think one of the things that I've heard more than a few friends echo is that this time has opened up a little bit of space, and space within the mind, and also space externally, for them to potentially connect a little bit more with nature than they had previously. For some, perhaps they do live surrounded by nature, or maybe in a suburban setting, and they just taking a little bit more notice of things that they may have been too rushed to notice before. For others, perhaps, who might live in the city, some people have left cities and they're suddenly finding themselves in a natural surrounding. And some are actually living out in the beautiful countryside, and just have, again, more time to appreciate it. I'm looking now at Susan, the wonderful Susan. I was just yesterday reading a beautiful piece that she wrote for the Urban Devi Collective, which was about the autumn season, and I was really touched by your reflections on just the changing of these seasons, and how we can internalize these lessons of transformation and letting go. So we have so many wonderful poets here, Rukmini Devi, and I see so many wonderful faces of those who I know are both very attuned to nature, very poetic, very deep-hearted and insightful. So thank you for being here today. It's such an honor to share this time with you. And I really hope and pray that I can share something today that's going to be some way inspiring, or help you to reflect on something a little bit. Before we begin, before we sort of formally enter the presentation, I guess I should say that in speaking about Vineet, or Venkata, actually sent me the title for this session, The Poetry of Nature. And I thought, oh, that sounds nice. And then I started to think about what do I actually want to say about the poetry of nature? And as I thought, it was like this, when you have a little thought cloud, and the cloud gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I felt that it's such an immense topic. It's such an immense source of inspiration for me, and for so many. If you just if you just Google nature poetry, or poets who have been inspired by nature, the list just goes on and on and on and on, because it is such a natural source of inspiration for centuries now. What to speak of our own impressions that we've gathered over a lifetime, things that inspire us. Anyway, I'll speak more about that. But I wanted to say that in speaking about this topic, I'm not a scholar. I did study English in university, but I'm not a scholar of poetry. I'm not an expert poet by any means. I'm not a botanist. There's so much that I don't know. But what I'm sharing with you today is coming from my genuine inspiration in the natural world, and how I also process my encounters with the natural world through the medium of art and creativity. So thank you once again. And I'm going to begin. So you see this this background here behind me. I'm sure you can tell I'm not actually sitting in a forest. I thought you wouldn't mind a little cheesy green screen going on here. But this is actually a beautiful painting which was done for a series of books on their bhakti literature. If I move to the side slightly, you can see some little faces, some personalities here in the background. So this beautiful scene depicts the gathering of, it's a historic gathering of sages in a great forest known as Naimisharanya. These sages gathered, the moment of these sages gathering starts off an extremely lengthy 18,000 verse epic known as the Bhagavat Purana, or the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is really a very, very, very long collection of poetic verse and narrative dialogues that encompass the stories of great saints, great lovers of God, and of God himself in many different forms. So I thought this was a beautiful way to start our discussion today, because these sages came to gather in this place to hear poetic descriptions of divinity. And it's no accident that they came to this wonderful forest. One of the things that we're going to speak about today is that a natural setting is, you could say, the ideal setting to listen to poetry, to reflect on divinity. So before we begin, I wanted to start with a sacred invocation. So just to clarify, if I didn't already, today we are speaking not just about nature poetry in the broadest sense, because of course nature itself can be seen through different lenses. I can see nature in an abstract sense, just beauty, shapes, forms. But what I'm speaking about today is both, it's my personal perspective as a person of faith, as a person who is pursuing the path of bhakti yoga, and indeed from the Sacred Ecology Forum, we're looking through the lens of the tradition of bhakti. So in the tradition of bhakti, we see everything as connected to the divine, as coming from a divine source, as an expression of divine power, splendor, beauty, and love. So this is the lens through which we're looking. So I want to begin, just like these sages in this forest would have done, with an invocation, which is a prayer that everything that I share today, which no doubt my words will be potentially a little clumsy, maybe I won't say things right, maybe I'll say something that's inaccurate, but my prayer is that whatever I share inspires within my heart and within yours more bhakti, which is love for God, love and a loving relationship, and an ability to remember that supreme in many different places and circumstances continuously. So I'd invite you to close your eyes. This is not only a prayer for me to recite for what I'm going to say, but a prayer for you to also reflect on, and please join in if you know the words. It's a prayer for you to reflect on, that whatever you're hearing will equally inspire that from your side. So it's a two-sided prayer we're making here. Hopefully you can hear the harmonium. So we first say a prayer to the great saints and masters of the bhakti yoga lineage, that they, as we are coming together in a virtual gathering in the forest, that they bless us to reflect on these teachings. We can recite the sacred syllable of Om together 3 times. Let's take a deep breath. time. Timirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktavinda. Samsara Davana Lalita Loka Tranaya Karunya Ghana Ganatva Praptasya Kalyana Gunarnavasya Vande Guru Shri Charanarvindam. Vande Guru Shri Charanarvindam. So this beautiful, the last verse that I just recited is a beautiful first example of how nature is used in a very powerful way in the poetry of bhakti. Some of you may know this prayer, Samsara Davanala Lidhaloka, that this cycle of birth and death, known as samsara, that the soul is caught in, the suffering that that cycle brings about is compared to a blazing forest fire. Please raise your hands if you may happen to live in a location where there forest fires happen. I don't know if there's anyone here. Let's see. Doesn't look like it. Maybe you don't have your camera on. Well, I was in California just recently working on some music, and for a couple of weeks, as I was going to the recording studio, I could smell smoke in the air. I could see sometimes there were emergency services going because a brush fire had started. And of course, we've heard the news of these raging forest fires, perhaps the worst they've ever been. Oh, somebody did raise their hand. Okay, so maybe we have someone in California. These forest fires have been absolutely devastating. So this suffering that is encountered by this cycle of samsara is compared to the blazing forest fire. And the mercy of the great master, the great teacher, ghana, 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 it's almost an onomatopoeic word. Sanskrit is very often has this onomatopoeic quality. If you don't know the word onomatopoeia, it means that the word sounds like the thing that it's describing. So ghana, ghana, these big monsoon rain clouds are rumbling in, ghana, ghana, ghana. Ghana ghanatvam, that the mercy, that karuna of the spiritual master is coming in like these monsoon clouds and is creating this deluge of rain that immediately soothes and puts out this forest fire. In that way, the person is meditating on the mercy of the spiritual master arriving in a way that is completely impossible to control, maybe difficult to predict, but when it comes, you feel it, you know it immediately in the heart. And then in the last stanza, Vande Guru Shri, I offer my grateful homage to that master whose feet are as soothing and as beautiful as the lotus flower. So we're going to come back to this metaphor of the lotus flower that is used so often in bhakti poetry. But for now, we'll just say it means beautiful, soothing, and the feet are the lowest part of the body. So it's an expression of humility to say, I put my head there at those feet. So beginning with that invocation, we start our exploration of poetry. The famous poet William Wordsworth, raise your hand if you've heard a William Wordsworth poem. Almost everyone, I think. I'm looking at Balaram because Balaram is right now living in the Lake District in the UK, where William Wordsworth lived and wrote many of his famous poems, including Daffodils. This is one of his very famous poems. I think you've been to his house, Balaram, right? Yes. So he said that he made a statement that poetry takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. And by that he implied also, and in his practice of writing, that this tranquil state might be most easily inspired if the poet would go out into nature and observe the world around him, then translate those observations into verse. And many poets of that era in Western poetry, the Romantic poets, were taking their inspiration from nature. Also, there was something that happened at that time. Some of you may know the history or may guess that the Industrial Revolution had happened, and the way that life was, the way that life had been previously very much more in harmony with nature, at least governed by many things that nature determines in terms of seasons and so on, was shifting. People were moving also away from the countryside and into the cities. So there's this beautiful stanza from a poem that Wordsworth wrote during that time, which also alludes to his connection with nature in a spiritual sense. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth, and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light. So he's seeing this celestial quality, this divine presence in every meadow, stream, and he says in every common sight. So even as he sees just a flower growing on a hill, he's feeling some celestial connection with it. So in that way, he is a poet who wrote in a much later era. But going back into the vast canon of bhakti poetry, which is really almost every analogy in bhakti poetry is nature related. So it's very appropriate to say it's an ocean of poetry. It's really, you can never find its end. You can never find its full depth. Perhaps the great masters do know its true depth because they're tasting something extremely profound. But this book I mentioned, the Bhagavad Purana, these 18,000 verses of poetry, they're extremely rich with nature as a setting, as metaphor, and as divinity itself. So this is what I wanted to guide us on today, just a little reflection or meditation on these three aspects. Nature as a temple in which to come into that space and contemplate something deep, to meditate, to contemplate divinity. but the main emphasis being that environment is conducive to such thoughts. Just as a temple, when you come into a temple, it's just a building. Ultimately, it's just bricks or stone, or it might be something even more humble. But when we come into that space, because it is a sacred space, because it's been designated as such, then naturally certain thoughts arise within the heart. So nature as a temple is our first. Secondly, nature as metaphor, how nature is used in bhakti poetry to connect, to enable us to relate to things which we may have no direct experience of. And finally, for instance, if we are to think of feet as divine, feet as being divine, it seems a strange thought. So this analogy of the lotus flower, a beautiful flower that, at least in the environment of the poets that were writing this, the lotus flower was something that they could see and relate to. So these feet are lotus-like. So we'll talk more about that later. So nature as a metaphor. And thirdly, nature as divinity itself. So speaking about great divine personalities, for instance, the earth herself, Bhumi Devi, or for instance, a river like Ganga Devi, these sacred rivers, they are goddesses, gods and goddesses. Or the Supreme Godhead, who, for instance, in the Bhagavad Gita, he speaks about how he is present in every aspect of nature. I am the light of the sun, I am the moon that gives the juice of life to all of the vegetables and plants. So nature as divinity, and also as a stimulus for a more specific remembrance of that divinity. The more that we start to know in bhakti, Godhead is known as a person, as a divine person. So the more that we know that supreme person, the more that we understand things about their attributes, about their activities, which we can start to actually reflect on as we encounter nature also. So these are the three things we're going to talk about today. And I hope we can cover it all, but I know we won't. We'll always come up short. There'll always be something missing, because there are just so many things to say. So let's see. I have so many notes here, and I'm enthusiastic to share them all with you. Perhaps. Okay, I'll go back to that one. So, of course, today we're speaking about bhakti poetry, and much of that poetry is, at least in the specific context or the tradition that I've been raised with, comes from India or a little bit broader into Asia, but mostly from India, from the Indian subcontinent. But of course, as I mentioned, William Wordsworth, poets throughout history have been inspired by nature. And one of the other most famous forms of nature poetry, which most of us have some experience with in school, we learn about in English class. Probably someone can guess if you've heard of the haiku, right? Who's heard of the haiku? The Japanese poetry form. We learn it as, okay, it's 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, and then we try and write our own, usually in school. So these Japanese poets, I'm not a scholar of this type of poetry, so I'm not sure when this form began and when was its primary era. But I did read many poems as I was growing up by one of its most famous exponents called Matsuo Basho. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He was writing in the 17th century. So he was a Zen Buddhist. And whilst he started out his writing career very much he was more living in an urban setting. As he got older, he became more of almost like a wandering wandering mendicant, wandering out into the wilderness and into nature, and writing these beautiful stanzas which encapsulated so much in their sutra-like length. So I'll read you a few of them, and I'm going to take a little time because they're the kind of things that they need a little space around them to just reflect on their meaning. The temple bell dies away. The scent of flowers in the evening is still tolling the bell. Here's another one. Heard, not seen, the camellia poured rainwater when it leaned. In bringing attention to these sacred moments of nature, where, almost ordinary moments of nature. So a camellia, it's a particular type of flower that the petals go up like this, and when rainwater it can hold some rainwater in it, and so but when it gets too heavy with rainwater, it just tips over. So he's just listening, and he hears this flower leaning, and he hears the water falling, and he understands that's what's happening. A deeper meaning is that as this water is dripping, filling the flower and leaning, he's actually writing about the arrival of spring as the ice starts to melt, and everything that represents also. And then further on, the cycle of life. So these poets like Basho, they examine nature as something that evokes a very deep lessons, deep reflections, and that awakens a deeper connection with spirit. So I wanted to just mention, before we go into our reflection on nature as a temple, my own journey of how I came to love nature, I guess. Maybe I can share my screen with you here. Let's see. Okay. Do you see that picture? Yes. That's my mother on the left with the big rhubarb leaves, and on the right is a very, very dear, she's sort of my second mother, my fairy godmother. So I grew up with these two nature lovers in my life. My mother is an avid gardener, and she also used to take me for these walks. She used to love learning about herbs, so she used to take me on these walks in these parks like Hampstead Heath in London, and a guide would be identifying different wildflowers and herbs, and we would take cuttings and paste them in a book and write little things about them. We did this from the time I was very young. And on the right is Sarva Mangala, my other mother, fairy godmother. She introduced me to the art and writings of an English author called Cicely Mary Barker, who did these beautiful paintings, I think they were in the early 1900s, called The Flower Fairies. So she looked around her and found all the wildflowers, the herbs, the trees, and she would paint them in a very botanically accurate way, and also create this beautiful fairy character and write a poem about that particular flower or plant. So I devoured these books when I was young, and I started to learn the names and the attributes and the properties of all the plants and the trees around me. This was something that I'm speaking about this because I believe that as we start to learn about the nature around us, we notice it more. Just as when I know a person, for instance, I see there's someone on my screen now, Helisha. Yes. So I don't know Helisha personally, but if I knew more about her, if I started to know more details about her, for instance, just the fact that I know her name allows me to point her out, allows me to notice her. If I started to know more details, then if I saw her in a room, I'd say, yes, that's Helisha, and she's like this and she's like that, and my attention would rest on her that little bit more. So as we start to know more about these plants and different entities within nature, we take more notice, and we also then start to just have a more continuous flow of awareness, which facilitates this sacred or divine connection also. So let's go back to I'll stop my sharing here. So nature as a temple, a setting that facilitates sacred contemplation. I wanted to read you a beautiful poem by another English author called Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It may indeed be fantasy when I essay to draw from all created things deep, heartfelt, inward joy that closely clings, and trace in leaves and flowers that round me lie lessons of love and earnest piety. So let it be. And if the wide world rings in mock of this belief, it brings nor fear, nor grief, nor vain perplexity. So will I build my altar in the fields, and the blue sky my fretted dome shall be, and the sweet fragrance that the wild flower yields shall be the incense I will yield to thee. Thee only, God, and thou shalt not despise, even me, the priest of this poor sacrifice. I really love this poem. Sometimes it can be difficult when listening to a poem in language that is sometimes not our first language, not our native first tongue, but also sometimes a poet is writing in just a little more archaic language. So it can be sometimes difficult when listening for the first time to get the meaning. But he's speaking here about his belief and his conviction that the world may mock, but that these fields are his altar, and the blue sky is the dome of his temple, and the beautiful fragrance of the flowers is the incense that he's offering to divinity. And he describes that as a poor sacrifice. It's a humble sacrifice. So this act of offering the abundance of nature unto divinity is a very core aspect of the bhakti tradition. I'll just share my screen again here. You can see here these beautiful sacred forms within the temple of Radha and Krishna, and they're decorated here with fresh flowers, fragrant flowers, in beautiful artistic designs. This is one expression of offering the poetry of nature unto divinity in a very tangible way. Within temple worship in the bhakti tradition, every day fresh flower arrangements and decorations are offered as an expression of worship, of love. That here is a beautiful aspect of the splendor of your creation, and my act of love is to arrange it as an offering of love. So, another beautiful poem. Some of you may be familiar with the great the great saint and leader within the founder of the Sikh tradition, Guru Nanak. So a wonderful story. One time he visited the great pilgrimage site of Jagannath Puri, and it's said that he came before the altar and he spontaneously began to sing, and he recited this song, which is still sung within the Sikh tradition regularly in regular worship. The sky is the prayer platter. Let's have some musical accompaniment for this. The sky is the prayer platter. The sun and moon are the lamps. The stars and the constellations are the pearls and jewels. The breeze blowing from the sandal-laden Malaya mountains is the incense. The air is the fan. The entire flora of the earth are the flowers. Oh, what an arti it is! O destroyer of fear! Spoken by Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So another very famous song that expresses something similar is one that I recorded some time ago now. It's in the Marathi language, and its author is the famous bhakti poet Sant Tukaram. Raise your hand if you've heard of this author, Tukaram. He's from the western side of India and Maharashtra, and he was active in the same time as many others within the bhakti tradition, Mirabai, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Guru Nanak. At that time there was an explosion of this bhakti poetry. So I did actually prepare a video for you, but I'm not entirely sure if you're going to be able to hear it if I play it. So I think what I might do is share the link for you so you can watch it later. But I'll just sing it myself for now. But it's really nice for you to watch this later because it's from a very old movie from the 1930s, and it just brings it to life to see him singing in that way. So he says, Vrikshavalli ama soyari vanachare Vrikshavalli ama soyari vanachare. He says the trees and the birds, just the trees. The trees are my dear friends, because the rustling of their leaves, he recites this poem as he's sitting alone in nature. He would do that a lot because he was a farmer, so he would go to the edge of his field and sit amidst the trees watching his crops, and he would write and meditate and sing the sacred name of the Lord. So he says that the rustling of the leaves sounds to me like they're chanting with me. So they're my dear friends joining together in Sankirtan, this congregational chanting of the name. Vrikshavalli ama soyari vanachare Vrikshavalli ama soyari vanachare. Then he says that the birds are my friends as well because they're singing with me. They're also joining in this beautiful chorus of the divine names. Pakshi suswane adaviti Pakshi suswane adaviti. He says that in this setting of nature, this beautiful setting like is behind me right now, which facilitates these sacred contemplative thoughts, I can understand that I don't actually need anything in life. He says, the sky is the only ceiling that I need, and the earth is my bed. And as he goes on to sing more, he says that I'm realizing that my body is just a vessel, and what's actually eternal is my soul. And what my soul lives on, the food that my soul lives on, is this Hari Katha, these words and songs about the divine. Panduranga Hari Jai Jai Panduranga Hari Panduranga Hari Jai Jai Panduranga Hari Panduranga 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 Vitala Panduranga 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 Vitala. So it's a really beautiful song, and I'll send you that little video clip, and I highly recommend watching the full film also. So great saints and gurus, here Tukaram, Sant Tukaram, he's using nature also as a metaphor, as he speaks about the sky as his ceiling, the earth as a bed. Great saints and gurus across traditions have long used nature as this rich resource for teaching, drawing analogies and metaphors from different plants and animals, birds, to illustrate different concepts. Within the bhakti tradition, the seed, the desire to practice a life of devotion, the spark of that is described as a seed, as a bija. And as that seed grows, it's known as a bhakti lata, a creeper or a vine of devotion. So for the practitioner, everything about their practice is compared to watering that seed so that the vine will grow more and more in a healthy way, eventually reaching that Supreme Person himself. Another very, very famous analogy that's used from nature, a metaphor, is that of a tree in all of its tolerance. So the tree, particularly now we're going into the autumn and winter seasons, and we see that the trees really go through so much. Well, not only have they had the blazing summer heat, but now they lose their leaves. For some, they're chopped for firewood. They endure temperatures, at least in the Western world, that become freezing. And yet still they're giving, they're solid, and they're giving of themselves. So that type of tolerance is extremely rare and difficult to cultivate. So in the practice of bhakti, the tree is used as a metaphor. There's a beautiful stanza, Trinadapi sunichena, taror iva sahishnuna. Taru means the tree. To remind us that we can take a lesson from this tree in how we practice. So this is a very simple example of how we can actually start to learn lessons from nature. As we remember stanzas like this, if I just go out the door and I see a tree, I can remember, okay, now the tree is tolerant, let me try to be tolerant today in this same way. There's a beautiful, another beautiful one that I love from Angelus Silesius, who was a German Catholic priest, again actually this is in the 15th century. He was also a profoundly successful poet. He says that he speaks about the rose. The rose blooms and knows not why, unencumbered by itself, oblivious to the eye. So he's saying that the rose blooms and doesn't think about someone looking at it and thinking, well, how beautiful you are. The rose blooms just because that's just what it does. That's just what flowers do. They bloom, they open. So it's a reminder that as we, for instance, as we serve in life, I serve because that's who I am. I am a being who is constitutionally meant to serve others, not because someone's watching me and saying, how great you are. You're helping an old lady across the road. You are such a great citizen. No, it's because that's just what I'm bound to do. So in that same way, bloom without thinking of the recognition that one might receive from others. In bhakti poetry, this metaphor is also used to enable us to relate to something that we may have never seen before. And a primary example of that, actually wait, before I speak about that, I wanted to, oh no, yes, we'll talk about that now. Something that we haven't seen before. So primary example is divine beauty. So I may have seen an extremely beautiful woman or man, but the type of beauty that's described when we hear these descriptions, particularly in texts like the Bhagavad Purana, it's sort of unrelatable. So they'll say the complexion, the color of the moon, or more radiant than the moon. So if I see the most glorious autumn full moon, and you just stand there in its radiance and you think, this is just incredibly beautiful. And then you think, this divine face that's being described is 1,000 times more beautiful than this. It's just inconceivable. It's mind-blowing. But it enables us to have a little glimpse. So nature is used to describe these aspects of divine beauty, whether it be a very common one, which is quite funny, is a nose like a sesame flower. I've actually never seen a sesame flower, but I want to see one because I've heard this analogy throughout my life. I think it must have a delicacy and it must relate to something about the way the nose is raised a little bit. Thighs like banana trunks. Eyes like the eyes of a doe, of a female deer, which are beautifully soft and they're shaded around the edges, just in such an elegant, graceful way. The lotus is also a very common one. And here is this is one of my favorite poetic verses ever. And I think about it often. This comes from a text, a beautiful poetic text called the Mukunda Mala Stotra. You can close your eyes if you like. This one is worth listening to with eyes closed. The desert of material existence has exhausted me. But today I will cast aside all troubles by diving into the lake of the Supreme Lord, Hari, and drinking freely of the abundant waters of His splendor. The lotuses in that lake are His hands and feet, and the fish are His brilliant, shining eyes. That lake's water relieves all fatigue and is agitated by the waves His arms create. Its current flows deep beyond fathoming. Karacharana saroje kantimane tramine Shramamushi bhujavichi vyakule gadhamarge Hari sarasi vighaya piya tejo jalogham bhavamaru parikinna klesham adya tajami. So whenever I feel exhausted by the ups and downs of life, I think of this verse. I think of diving into this beautiful fatigue-relieving lake of that Supreme Person. So you will, I'm sure, as you encounter different aspects of bhakti poetry, encounter so many of these beautiful metaphors, and you probably have some favorite ones yourself. There's so many of them that I'm going to move on to our next meditation because it's just unlimited. Another beautiful one that I wanted to mention actually that's used is there are two birds, the chakora bird and the chakravaka bird. The chakora is a type of partridge, actually. I've been researching some of these birds because I wanted to know more about them even before. I'm very curious. So in poetry from India, Pakistan, etc., this chakora bird is said to subsist only on moonlight. It's said to eat moonlight. And so it's always looking towards the moon, and in that way it's used as a metaphor for the lover that can't take their eyes away from the beloved. They can never take their eyes away from that moon-like, radiant, beautiful face. The other bird, a chakravaka, is said that it will only drink rainwater. It won't drink any other water. So in order to drink, it has to wait for the rain to come. So it's always looking to the sky, waiting for these rain clouds, because when the rain clouds will start to release their water, then finally it can drink. So this bird is used to describe the devotee who is awaiting the presence or the grace of the Supreme. I love these analogies as well. So we've spoken about nature as a temple, nature as a metaphor, and now to speak about nature as divinity, the divinity of nature. So I know that in the Sacred Ecology Forum, who is our main host today for this session, one of the purposes of this collective is to help to facilitate our awareness of the divinity of nature, of how being a person of faith, being a practitioner of a spiritual life is not different from having an awareness and connection to the sacredness of nature. Of course, within most spiritual traditions that are rooted in connection with the natural world, whether they be that of, let's say, African spiritual traditions, Native American traditions, And we've spoken about Zen Buddhism, which takes its awareness and focus from nature. And also in the Bhakti tradition, there's really a worldview, which is that behind everything tangible in this realm is a divine personality who governs over that tangible form, whether it be a river, a tree, a mountain. And this is in a different section from the metaphor section. I want to point that out because these divine personalities, the river is the divine personality is not a metaphor for the river, and the river is not a metaphor for the divine personality. They're believed to be really present, just not visible to the eye, only visible by that form which they take in this realm. So an example is the great Ganges River. In India, the Ganges River is known as also Ganga Devi, and the goddess of that river, Ganga Devi, also another name of Ganga Devi is Jahnavi. So that's the connection behind my name. And she's worshipped as a goddess. That's why you'll see people bringing offerings to the water. They're setting lamps on the water, offering flowers, and putting ashes into that water also as a way of entrusting them to this goddess. So I wanted to start off this section of nature as divinity with a poem that I wrote. It's not a very good poem, I have to say. It's not false humility, but it touches on something that I wanted to highlight, which is that we don't have to only look to the poems of great poets of the past for connection with the divinity of nature. It's something that we can awaken within ourselves at all times. So this is a poem I wrote about 10 years ago in New York City, and it was a reflection on the fact that these divine sacred rivers of India, the Ganges, the Yamuna River, they are worshipped. And yet, why don't we worship the rivers that are around us here in the environment that we live in? So I would go regularly to the bank of the Hudson because for me, I'm a real nature lover, and I need to be around some rivers or some trees pretty much daily if I can. So I'd walk to the Hudson and just sit there, and I was thinking, well, why don't we worship the Devi of the Hudson? I'm sure this river also has a great goddess who is present here. So this is my prayer to Hudson Devi. Your broad face, ribbed with waves, silently watching, absorbing. We forget to bow to you, O Devi of the city. Jogging past your body, admiring your beauty, feeding you our daily remains. We forget to pray. No flowers sit atop the zigzags carved by tourist boats at dusk. You reach your fingers beneath the gum-covered concrete, touching iron and earth and forgotten prayers, buried deep below the rumbling office blocks. O Devi, forgive us as we tut and call you dirty. Your wide banks reflect the span of your compassion. Tonight, at sunset, you sing a quiet song. As the trees around you sleep, you sing of your faraway sisters, of sandy banks where blessed feet stand, offering evening prayers. So this was my meditation on the Hudson as being connected to all these great sacred rivers. I really believe that everything is connected. There's not just one place that's sacred and the other is not. Some places are extra sacred for a special reason, but really everywhere is sacred because everywhere is a manifestation of divinity, divine creation power. So the exemplar of worship of nature, of celebration of nature, and the person who is behind the beauty of nature in at least the lineage of bhakti that I follow, that I've grown up in, is Sri Krishna. So I wanted to share a picture with you here. Let's see. Sorry, I'm still getting used to sharing my screen. Okay. So this beautiful image depicts Krishna at Krishna and his brother Balaram. They're running into the forest in the sacred realm of Vrindavan, which is also said to be manifest here in this world as it's a town, a pilgrimage town, about 2 hours away from New Delhi in India. So Sri Krishna, who is the supreme person, who's the Godhead himself, he's depicted in this way as growing up in this beautiful pastoral setting where all these trees, the animals, the flowers, they're all just thrilled at every moment to be near him. They are offering their love to him. The trees, they ooze sap out of love for him. The flowers bloom when he passes by. The grass thrills with delight at feeling the touch of his feet. The animals just want to be around him and close to him all the time. The trees bend in showing their respect and affection. So I wanted to share a beautiful verse from that Bhagavad Purana, which describes Sri Krishna. It's a very famous verse, a very beloved verse. I love it very much myself. And the reason I want to... Let me share it first and then I'll explain it. Wearing a peacock feather ornament upon his head, blue karnikar flowers on his ears, a yellow garment as brilliant as gold, and the Vaijayanti, the forest flower garland, Sri Krishna exhibited his transcendental form as the greatest of dancers as he entered the forest of Vrindavan, beautifying it with the marks of his footprints. He filled the holes of his flute with the nectar of his lips, and the cowherd boys sang his glories. So, like most of the verses in the Bhagavatam, this is written in rhyming, in poetic verse, rhythmic verse. Barhapidam natavaravapu karanaya karanikaram bibradvasaha kanakakapisham Vaijayantim chamalam Randran venor adhay sudaya Purayan gopavinde Vrindaranyam swapadaramanam Pravishad gita kirti. So this verse describes Krishna as he enters the forest. And in that place, he exchanges in love with all of these entities. He sees them, he experiences them as having personality. He can speak to them, they can speak to him. This is an extremely important concept within the bhakti tradition. we may not be able to speak. I may not be able to speak to Hudson Devi. Well, not have a conversation at least. I can speak to her. It's not something of imagination for the bhakti practitioner to relate with the trees, to relate with all the sentient beings around us. And when we relate, just as I was mentioning before, when we know the name of something, when I know that that's not just a tree, that's a cherry tree. What kind of cherry tree is it? Oh, it's an ornamental cherry. Is it a white cherry or a pink cherry? It's a particular shade of dark pink, and this is the time that it flowers. The more that I know, the more I know this personality, and I can relate with it, I can offer my respect. Furthermore, I can appreciate its divinity. As is said in the Bhagavad Gita, all wondrous and beautiful creations are a spark of my splendor. So in this way, the nature that surrounds us starts to become a stimulus for not only remembering that the earth itself is divine, that trees are divine, that flowers are divine and sacred, worthy of our respect, but a stimulus for smaranam. Smaranam is a process within the bhakti tradition, which means remembrance, contemplation on the divine. So one example of that smaranam is that when I know that, for instance, the eyes, so here actually it brings it all together. So the eyes of the Supreme, the eyes of Sri Krishna are said to be lotus-like. There we have a metaphor. They're lotus-like. Okay, well, have I seen a lotus? Maybe I haven't seen a lotus. Have I seen a beautiful flower? Okay, I've seen a beautiful flower. So they must be beautiful like a flower. So the next time I see a beautiful flower, I notice the attributes of that flower. I think about its divinity. And then I may think back to these beautiful lotus-like eyes that were described in this poetry. So a very famous verse that is spoken by a great saint called Kunti Devi. I was just actually recording this verse in the recording studio 2 days ago, so hope to release this song a little later in the year. Nama Pankajanabhaya, Nama Pankajamaline, Nama Pankajanetraya, Namaste Pankajangraye. She says, I offer my respectful love and homage to that Lord whose navel is like a lotus flower, Pankajanabhaya. We can do the lotus flower mudra together, or you can do double like this. Let's see if everyone can make lotus flowers. I'm looking onto page 2 as well. Oh no, we have lots of cameras off there. All right, everyone that's on page 1. So, Nama Pankajanabhaya, you can put it by your navel. I offer my respect to that one whose navel, even his navel, even as something as unpoetic as a belly button, is like a lotus flower. Namo Pankajamaline. His eyes, here's a petal, here's Rangi. Rangi should do it. Rangi is a classical dancer, and I also used to study this dance form. We can do it together. We can all do it together. So his eyes are like lotus petals that taper at the edges. Yes, Rangi's got 2 going. Here's the lotus, and here's the eye. Beautiful. Rangi, you can show us the, for the next one, do this growing lotus. See how she's swirling her hands around? Beautiful. You can try that if you want. Namo Pankaja Netraya. His glance is as cooling as the lotus. Just the glance itself. Can you show us that, Rangi? The cooling glance. You can have a moment to think about it. Yes. Beautiful. And I offer my respectful obeisances to those 2 lotus feet, which are like 2 lotus flowers. Oh, beautiful. We spotlighted you. All right, now we have to do it again. I'm going to sing and you can accompany me. Nama Pankajanabhaya. Nama Pankajamaline. Nama Pankajanetraya. Namaste Pankajangraye. Thank you. That was completely spontaneous. Thank you, Rangi. So, in this way, listening to this beautiful prayer, I've known this prayer for a long time, but I myself had never seen a lotus flower. I grew up in England. I know, I see Rukmini Devi here. She is from Washington, D.C., or she lives there. And in Washington, D.C., you can go see some amazing lotus flowers, right? There's some beautiful gardens where you can see lotuses growing. But I had never seen a lotus in England. The climate it's not really possible to grow them except in a greenhouse type of setting. But since I was a child, I'd been hearing these analogies, these metaphors of the lotus flower. So what I thought was a lotus flower, I'd seen a water lily, which is different, I should point out. A lot of people think it's the same thing, but it's not. So that was as much as I knew. So one time when I was in my early 20s, I was in Australia and I was on a farm. And I went for a walk in the midday sun, which is always a bad idea. It tends to be something English people do, is walk out in the sun and get burnt and get dehydrated. So I walked out, and about 10 minutes later, I was like, oh my God, why did I do this? I'm so hot now. I'm really struggling. I kind of feel like that now because I'm in a room where actually, I'll show you at the end, there's a beautiful tulsi plant growing and there's a big grow light above it and it's very hot. It's supposed to simulate the sunlight, so I'm getting a little hot here. So I was just like, oh gosh. But then I thought, well, I'm sort of halfway, like I could see ahead of me there were some trees and I thought maybe I can take shelter there, I can get in the shade. And I'm sort of halfway, so I won't go back to my room now. I'm kind of enacting this as we go along. I'm going to take my sweater off. So I walked along further and suddenly I came to the bend in the road and I stopped in my tracks. It was the most incredible sight I've ever seen in nature. It was a vast lake filled with lotus flowers and they were all just swaying in the gentle breeze. They were kind of half shaded actually, half shade, half sun. It's hard to put into words the pure poetry of that moment. There was like all these things firing off within me. On one level, I was appreciating the visual beauty of that scene. Just to see these lotus flowers and their purity and perfection, the beautiful gradient of colors, to pink to white, and the saffron centers. I was appreciating the sensory experience. I could literally feel a coolness emanating from the lotuses. And at the same time, it was like zing, zing, zing. All these things were slotting in that I'd heard since I was a child, that, oh, his glance is as cooling as a lotus. I was like, oh, now I understand the feet as beautiful as lotus flowers. I felt such a relief from that moment of intense sun and discomfort. And in that moment, then also a prayer came from my heart, appreciating how both that that Supreme Lord who I was remembering, and then also how these aspects of his beauty are present all around us to give us a little window. So within the Bhakti tradition, this is something which we're encouraged to do always. Another beautiful commentary in the Bhagavatam says that the beautiful song of the birds is but the whispering of his voice. So when I hear the bird song, to remember the voice of the Lord. It's also said that his voice is poetically compared to the deep rumbling of the clouds, that gentle rumble that comes before a gentle rainfall, not the scary rumbling. I tried to practice this smaranam. In London there are since the 1980s, these green parakeets that you see in India. They are wild all over London and the surrounding counties of London, including where I live. Not right now, I don't live there now, but where I often am in England. These green parrots are there in Vrindavan as well. And the green parrot is said to be the messenger bird of Vrinda Devi, the goddess that presides over Vrindavan. So when I hear the sound of those parrots in England, I remember Vrinda Devi, I remember the forest of Vrindavan, and I remember Sri Krishna. Another funny one is in New York, you have these trees. The type of tree is called the London plane tree. It's a tree that has been especially planted in cities all over the world because it is extremely efficient at absorbing pollution. So these trees have a kind of round type of seed pod that grows. You'll see these balls up there in the trees. And in India, there's a type of flower called kadamba, which is also in the shape of a ball. It's really beautiful and very fragrant, and it's often made into garlands that adorn the deity in the temple. So when I go past these trees and I see these seed pods, I think of the kadamba flowers, and then I think of the garlands, and then I think of the deity in the temple. So in that way, it can start to become a practice which we can do. Sometimes it can feel a little bit forced initially, but it soon becomes something that's a natural way of being. And in that way, we start to achieve the desired goal in bhakti, which is to be remembering continuously the Supreme Lord. So I wanted to read you another poem that I wrote inspired by this principle. And I know we're almost coming to the end. I'm taking it right down to the wire with my notes here. I'm hopefully going to get through almost everything. So I'm not sure in America if you have a flower called forget-me-not. Do you have a flower called forget-me-not? Yes. So in England, also there's a flower called forget-me-not. It's a very beautiful, some people might even sometimes consider it a weed just because it's a wild flower. It pops up in the garden, you know, you may not have planted it. And the flowers they're little flowers, and they have beautiful variegated colors that range from a kind of candy pink to lilac to a deep blue. Sometimes people call this blue forget-me-not blue. I have Vanita here, who is a fashion stylist, and she will definitely know forget-me-not blue. So these flowers, I really love them. And one of the reasons, I believe that at some point in days of yore, they got the name forget-me-not because they came to symbolize a lover giving them to a beloved to say, please don't forget me. I give you this little humble posy of these little flowers. So I really love them, and they grow everywhere. So I often go for walks around home every day, and part of the reason is to connect with nature. This is my poem. It's my habit when walking to pick you some flowers, so I do, clasping the stems in one hand for the next half an hour while the sky darkens. But only when I put them at your feet do I realize I've picked forget-me-nots, sky blue with yellow centers and some a touch of pink. Each one I realize a small prayer. I know you bestow limitless mercy upon everyone, but I fear sometimes that I'm not included in everyone, or just that my desire is not sincere. I fear that not being anchored to you, I will be so easily swept away, like each tiny flower. I'm so small. But please, see my prayer and disregard its ineloquence. Please see my desire and help me to purify it. And though I'm so far from your feet, please see me down here and forget me not, forget me not. So it's a nice point to end on because I did plan to sing another song, and maybe we can see if we have a few extra minutes. But I wanted to encourage everyone in this practice of contemplation in whatever surroundings we happen to find ourselves, to not consider any aspect of nature to be ordinary. Even a small square of grass, there's something to learn from it. Even a branch that has been discarded on the ground, that's broken from the tree, there's something to see, there's something to learn. And it really is a practice. All of the poets that I have quoted from today were keen observers of nature. And as the more that we observe nature, the more that we try to make this connection, the easier it becomes, the more natural it becomes. And it is actually very natural. It shouldn't be forced. It's more like remembering to do something that we should have always been doing. It's just that we get disconnected from it. So I want to really encourage all of you, and I hope that maybe feel free. You can. I'll put some of my contact info in the chat box, and if you find yourself doing this, or you write a poem, or you want to share something, a reflection, I would really love to hear from you, because this is the first time that I've ever done a session like this. I'm not sure why, but I'm grateful to the Sacred Ecology Forum for inviting me to do this, because I've really enjoyed sharing with you, and I hope that it hasn't been too wordy or too scattered, but these are some of my inspirations. So I want to pause because I want to honor the fact that we are meant to end now, actually 1 minute ago. There's one poem that I didn't read, but I don't really need to, because it's recorded in the form of a song, which is the song Like a River, which is on my album, Like a River to the Sea, which was a reflection on frustration at sometimes trying to see divinity in nature all around, but not being able to because of the destruction and pollution which is taking place in our natural world. So that piece is a meditation on that. So I will mention it now, and just in case you can go and find the song and listen to it. But I want to hand over to our hosts, and they can decide where we go from here. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Jahnavi. This has been, I don't have words for how lovely this experience has been, and we're just so grateful. As Jahnavi mentioned, we do want to honor everyone's time, and so we completely understand if at this point folks do need to jump off of the call because the formal presentation has come to a close. But for those of us who can stay, and Jahnavi, if we can impose upon you, you're being so generous with your time and with your heart already, if we can impose upon you to stay a little bit longer, we would love to have you recite that poem And in fact, some questions have come in privately to me, and one of them was a request to actually have you speak a little bit more about what inspired you to write Like a River, and and how that poem, perhaps we can hear a little bit more about what sounds, at least to some of us, like a tension between our need to see the divinity and the beauty in nature, and also recognizing the very real harm that's being done to nature, and where we might have an opportunity to take more of an activist role. So that was one of the questions that was asked. And since you had that intention anyway, for those who can stay, we would love to have you recite that poem and perhaps speak to it a little bit. And then there are a couple of other questions that, if you're able to stay a little bit longer,
Yeah.
we can get into.
Yeah, I'm really happy to stay. I will speak about that poem, and then I just wanted to say that for everyone else, I'm assuming everyone that's on Zoom has signed up for this session by giving an email address. So I can give a few links and things that I mentioned today to our hosts, and perhaps they can send them out to you for anything that I didn't touch on, which you might like to follow up on after. Um, so thank you to everyone who has to, if you do have to leave now, thank you so much. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to share like this. It's very encouraging for me and inspiring for me, and I'm very grateful for your time and attention. So I will go to, I had that poem here, Like a River, yes. I should really know the words because I wrote it, but I'm just, sometimes when you, on the spot, you forget things. So I actually I wrote this as a poem in 2007, which is a long time ago now. It wasn't meant to be a song. At the time, I didn't write songs, and I didn't have an intention to write songs. And it wasn't actually meant to ever be read by anybody. It was just something that I wrote in my journal. And the context was, perhaps some people have heard the story before because I've told it many times, but I had visited this sacred pilgrimage town of Vrindavan when I was a child, 7 years old. So that was in 1994. And in 1994, the road going into Vrindavan was a sandy road. There was no pavement, there was no tarmac. The road was really a tunnel of trees, sort of like what you can see behind me now. This was how it looked going into Vrindavan. You could hear peacocks, you could hear parrots, you could hear the beautiful sounds of nature, and people also would bathe freely in the Yamuna River. It was a really beautiful place. And I know some people on this call had visited Vrindavan even many, many years before that, decades even before that. So this time that I was there at 7 years old, it left such a deep impression on me, and I didn't go back there until I was 21. And I was so much looking forward to it because I had had such a wonderful experience. So I got an extreme shock when I went back. I don't know what I was quite expecting, but I think I thought that it maybe hadn't changed that much. As I was coming up on the road, basically everything that I remembered seemed almost unrecognizable. I didn't recognize the place of my memory. The road had completely changed. Everything that had been done to facilitate more traffic to come in had been done. The wildlife, the animals had changed. The trees were hugely reduced. There was so much pollution, there was so much litter, trash. The river had become what people were telling me at the time was effectively mostly sewage because it had been dammed up farther upstream. It was really devastating to enter into to seeing that in a place that I and so many pilgrims consider most sacred. So I wrote I wrote these words, and I wrote a lot more words initially. I condensed them down into this song. I'm going to read it actually. I don't usually read it, I normally sing it, but I'm going to read it. The well I drank from has run dry. The riverbed has moved over years. Now cell phones ring instead of bells. The sacred hill has almost disappeared. Prayers and ashes at the river's edge, drifting side by side. Sun rises over new hotels. Sages close their eyes. Will I always be a stranger here in the heart of sacred beauty? You say this road can lead me home, so I'm following your footprints in the sand. I see the chaos and the barren trees. Maybe I'm blind. Crowds of people falling to their knees. Is this place divine? These were the verses. I was struck by, since I had last been there, the internet had arrived, cell phones had arrived, and these were real experiences I had. I was in the temple, and I kept hearing people's cell phones going off, and I thought, how crude and how disrespectful. We're in this most sacred place, and it's like, you're like, what? I just want to hear that soft sound of the temple bells and the birds and the hotels. There were so many, all these hotels that had sprung up and housing developments. So I was struggling to see how this place was seen as divine by others. Why were they not protecting it? And also to experience divinity in that place. So with my very dear friend Gauravani, his mother Rukmini and his aunt Susan are here. And I shared this poem with him, and he said, "Oh, that should be a song. We should make that into a song." I was like, "A song?" And he said, no, we really should. So he wrote these words of the chorus. My heart flows like a river to the sea. May it always be, may it always be. A river of grace flows through me. May it always be, may it always be. These words allude to the prayer of the great Saint Kunti Devi, whose prayer we recited about the different lotus-like aspects of Krishna. She says that as the river Ganges forever flows to the sea, may my attraction, may my attention forever be drawn towards you without any obstruction or interruption. So there's much more I could say about this, but really ultimately my meditation there was, as the time continued, that there are different planes of reality. It's not that one reality is less real than another. There's a material reality, which is that here's a place that is not being protected, is not being cared for properly, and as a result the environment and the people that live there are suffering, and that needs our care, needs our attention, needs our awareness, and as Venkata mentioned, our activism. However, that doesn't negate the fact that divinity and that sacredness is always present there, running beneath the surface. So may it always be that my attention is always being drawn there in an unobstructed way. May I not just look and see this dirty environment. And this relates to the world that surrounds us when we walk out the door also. If I walk out in the city and I think, oh, this is just a dirty place. No, it's a sacred place, because as per the bhakti tradition, God is residing within the heart of everyone. So it means I'm in a sacred temple right now, because He is all around me, everywhere. But let me also be awake and activated to do something, to care for, to protect the environment, as an act of devotion, as an act of love. So, yeah, that's what I would say about that song for now. Maybe there's another question or comment.
Thank you so much. We have a few other questions. So one question, and I've kind of combined some of the questions for the sake of time as well. So one question asks, you've spoken so much about kind of connecting with nature. And at the same time, it seems like some of these spiritual texts tell us to transcend nature, to transcend that we are not Prakriti, that we are, that this is not our true home. And so do you see that as a kind of a contradiction or a paradox? And if so, how do you resolve that?
It's a great question. My understanding is that, so yes, as I was speaking about, there's different levels of reality. So some traditions will negate the very existence of this place, and that it's all to be rejected and to be detached from. My understanding is that just as right now I have a body to use for service, I have a body with which my soul is being carried like a driver in a car through on this journey of life. And when this life is finished, this body will be discarded. But it doesn't mean that right now it's not real. It doesn't mean that I don't have to nourish it with good food and with water. It doesn't mean that I don't take care of it. So in that way, this world is, you could say, not real in that it's temporary. It will not exist eternally, at least through the lens of the bhakti tradition. This world is subject to creation and dissolution, so it is temporary. But right now we are living within it. And so just as I might have the interest for myself, just as, if I just shut my finger in a door, I'll be so concerned with the pain in my finger that all my attention will go to my finger. And it's like, oh, I won't think about anything else. I'm that concerned with this body. It's that real, what I'm living in. And so in that same way that this world is real, we should, I shouldn't say we should, I should speak to myself and say I should feel the pain that Mother Earth is going through when I see the pollution, the destruction of the environment, the changing of the climate. I should feel that pain within my heart and try to understand what little thing I can do as an act of care and love. Because right now we are in relationship, in a dynamic relationship. I hope that speaks to the question. There's so much more that can be said, and there's more qualified people than me to speak about that, but that's a brief answer.
Thank you. I think it was a lovely and a very practical answer as well. So switching gears a little bit, another question asks, you so much of the poetry that you shared, both in terms of other poets who have inspired you and your own poetry, seems very evocative of Mirabai, the poetess or the poet saint. And so there's this question of if you found the same kind of resonance drawing from nature in the poetry of Mira, if you've studied the poetry of Mira.
I love some of the poetry of Mirabai. I love very much, but I haven't actually studied her poetry that much. I think perhaps one of the reasons is because the tradition that I grew up with has so many poets within it, and that literature has been more focused on with the teachers and those around me, the artists around me. And then at a certain age, at a young age, I started to study the classical arts of South India, so the dance form of Bharatanatyam and Carnatic music. And those traditions focus on poets from South India who also write in Tamil, Telugu, these other languages. So I was sort of split between Bengali, Sanskrit, and those other South Indian traditions more so. And so Mirabai's poetry, somehow in the mix, it just got a little bit left out. But I'm more familiar with the song versions of her poetry, the ones that have become recorded and well known. There are so many that I really, really love. So yeah, I love her poetry, and I actually included one here. I didn't end up reading it, but she, of course, in the same way that many bhakti poets do, uses natural metaphors very, very frequently.
A couple of more questions, but in the interest of time, perhaps I'll ask you one more, and this one
Mm-hmm.
takes a little bit more of a personal approach. We have someone who is a student asking, are there particular rituals and perhaps even daily rituals that are part of your practice to stay connected to nature and stay connected to the divine through nature? And if so, would you mind sharing some of those with us?
What a great question. Um, I'm only looking down because I've just noticed that I didn't realize my computer was getting drained of battery. So just in case, I'm going to enter this call from my phone because I think we might have a problem here. Okay, let's see. I'm going to close. Oops.
Jenny, I think you're muted out.
I think you need to unmute me. All right, so I'm on my 1% of battery. I guess that solution didn't work. Um, Daily practices for me, the best practice is a daily walk, a meditation walk. So I will try to go out for a walk every day and observe nature. And often I do my meditation chanting whilst I'm doing that. For me, that's been something I've been doing for more than a decade, and it's one of the most wonderful ways that I like to connect with nature. I also I also like to write, and so writing from those experiences, those things that I observe, that helps me to process and digest what I see and to reflect on it. So these two things I would always highly recommend: walking in nature and writing about it, and meditating, of course.
Thank you. You spoke about, or you shared how you felt that, you felt a little bit shy about your poetry, or you felt like, you weren't necessarily, um, an expert in that field. But I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that we're just so touched and moved by your sharing, especially of your original poetry. And we hope that as part of your own practice and part of your own journey as both a writer and a bhakti practitioner, that you will continue to write and share your poetry. And there are a couple of folks who have requested, and they've given their email addresses for just written, just the poems in written form. So if that's
Thank
something
you.
that you're comfortable sharing, we can put you in touch with
Sure.
them.
That's so encouraging. Thank you. I would love to share them.
And thank you all for joining us for this kind of inaugural collaborative experience of the Eco Bhakti Weekend, and especially for this session. We hope to offer more programming like this in the future, so please do stay connected to the Sacred Ecology Forum, to the Bhakti Center, to the Hindu Life Program at Princeton University. And we so much appreciate your participation in co-creating this experience of Eco Bhakti. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your weekend.